President Faust, Dean Robert Post, and citizens united. It's my great pleasure as chair of the Tanner Committee and director of the Mahindra Humanities Center to welcome you to Harvard's most stimulating and joyous rite of spring, the Tanner Lectures. Although President Faust and Dean Martha Minow will have the substantive pleasure of introducing the event and our distinguished speaker, I want to reserve a moment for myself to mark Robert Post's presence here. When Robert spent a year at Harvard, he frequently made the long and perilous journey between the law school and the Mahindra Center, as many others from the law school have too. We welcomed his participation and greatly enjoyed his company. Robert proved himself to be a daring act on the interdisciplinary high wire. I could do no better than to open this occasion with words of his own. Every time he says disciplinary, imagine inter in brackets before disciplinary. I quote from an article by him in Critical Inquiry. As scholars within a discipline negotiate the stress of satisfying new demands, they debate the question of disciplinarity. The stakes of such debates can be characterized instrumentally as a form of opportunism in knowledge production. But this characterization is incomplete. Disciplinary debates are always also about professional identity and solidarity. They're about the substantive nature of a disciplinary practice, the kind of discursive community scholars desire to inhabit, the kind of work that they find most meaningful and gratifying, the kind of colleagues they wish to recognize as peers, the forms of disciplinary language that are most suited to scholarly aspirations. These are deeply important and consequential matters, and they're all implicated in debates about the meaning of disciplinarity. On behalf of the Tanner Committee, I want to express our gratitude to those who have so generously agreed to respond to Dean Post's lectures today, tomorrow, and Friday morning. Nadia Urbinati, Lawrence Lessig, Pamela Carlin, and Frank Michelman. Biographies are all in the program that you have, as are the names of my wonderful colleagues on the Tanner Committee. I want to thank Larry Lessig for doing the pre-Tanner seminar that we've started doing over the last couple of years, where we discuss the speaker's work a month before the speaker arrives. And Larry did a splendid, I don't know where you are, Larry. Oh, there you are. Did a very splendid seminar for us. Thank you very much for doing so. Thank you all for being here today. President Faust.
Thank you. Thank you, Homi. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Tanner Lectures on Human Values, an occasion that annually brings our university community together and connects us more closely to a wider world of ideas and inquiry. The Tanner Lectures were established at Cambridge University in 1978, and they now take place annually at 9 universities in the United States and abroad. They're named for Obert Clark Tanner. Born in 1904 and raised in a small mountain town in Utah, he was the youngest of 10 children. He undertook an early entrepreneurial endeavor, making class rings in his mother's basement, and this grew into a remarkably successful career at the helm of the O.C. Tanner Company, a leading manufacturer of employee recognition awards. His success in business enabled Mr. Tanner to live a life, in his words, of adventure and variety. He could broaden the scope of his intellectual and philanthropic interests, and he devoted himself to understanding and improving the human condition through the life of the mind. He taught philosophy at the University of Utah for decades. He generously supported art and art making, most notably through the design and construction of unique fountains, including our own well-known Tanner Fountain, which is at the moment surrounded with screens and curtains as it is being revitalized as part of the Plaza project. And he also made donations to create philosophy rooms in 11 different college and university libraries. Higher education inspired Mr. Tanner's most profound and most abiding admiration and support. He said, "The university is absolutely the greatest creation of human existence. It has the greatest promise, the greatest help, the greatest meaning for finding what is true and what is valuable." He considered these lectures, and I quote him again, "a search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values. This understanding may be pursued for its own intrinsic worth, but it may also eventually have practical consequences for the quality of personal and social life." And so every year we gather to celebrate universities, what they are and what they mean for humanity, to celebrate the values that Mr. Tanner articulated so powerfully. We also gather in order to seek a deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. We are very lucky this year to have Robert Post as the exemplar of so much of what these lectures have come to represent. I know they energize me every year, and I hope they energize you as well. We'll hear the first lecture this afternoon, and a second lecture will take place here tomorrow at the same time. Then on Friday, there will be a seminar with our guest in the Thompson Room of the Barker Center at 10 a.m., an opportunity for members of the Harvard community to discuss the ideas that will be presented here over the next 2 days. And the details of these gatherings are in your program. I thank the Harvard Tanner Faculty Committee for appointing today's lecturer, and I thank the staff of the Mahindra Center for all the work in bringing this lecture to us today. And of course, I extend my deepest appreciation to Homi Baba, the director of the center. Thank you, Homi. It's now my great privilege to turn the podium over to the perfect person to introduce Robert Post. She's known him since she was a first-year student, is that right, in law school when he was a third-year student. So we're going to have the treat of hearing what the real Robert Post is like from his counterpart dean, Martha Minow.
Good afternoon, and it is a distinct pleasure and honor to be able to introduce Robert Post, who is our Tanner lecturer here. Google tells us that Robert Post is a psychologist who works on spatial orientation and motion perception. He is also an artist whose paintings of living beings combine realism and vivid colors in acrylic and oils. He's also, as it turns out, an uproariously funny one-man variety show, as well as the Sol and Lillian Goldman law professor and dean at Yale Law School. Now, the law school professor's book, written in 2012, called Democracy, Expertise, and Academic Freedom, actually gives us some tools for sorting through the very democratic and inclusive results of internet searches that lead me to wonder, in fact, how to introduce this professor, artist, psychologist, and one-man variety show. For in his elegant 2012 analysis, Professor Dean Post uncovers the tension between the premise of equality embedded in robust freedom of speech and expertise devised by disciplines and requiring indicia of reliability and excluding the unreliable. Undeniably committed to equality, Post nonetheless instructively develops a notion of democratic competence to guide judicial protection of academic speech and expert knowledge from government overreaching, while ensuring that communities of debate and internal discipline are devised by mutually critical experts. Striking in its ambition to sketch a sociology of knowledge, this book, like much of Robert Post's work, simultaneously demonstrates great learning and palpable awareness of the concrete demands of ensuring both quality and breathing room for the work that teachers and professors do. Based on my membership in a group of mutually critical experts, I can attest that the Robert Post before us is indeed an expert in examining law to pursue human values. He is also, in fact, a psychologist, attentive to the spaces of debate and meaning. He's also an artist, making the world both more real and more vivid, and he is, in fact, a one-person variety show. In his scholarship, teaching, and colleagueship, Robert continually brings the wisdom of a psychoanalyst, frankly, as well as the perspective of a geographer, locating the operations of psyche and the movement of discussions in memorable maps of human hopes and experience. For example, in his Harvard Law Review Forward, Fashioning the Legal Constitution, Culture, Courts, and Law, Robert Post considers whether Supreme Court justices demonstrate swagger, confidence, or arrogance in trying to remove hot issues from the arena of politics to the realm of constitutional rule. In Prejudicial Appearances, the Logic of American Anti-Discrimination Law, Dean Post observes one field that is largely neglected by champions of civil rights, that of appearance discrimination. Why is it that civil rights advocates don't push for employers to avoid discriminating on the basis of appearance, as they do for color blindness or gender neutrality? Post describes as an alternative to the ever more abstracted legal treatments of discrimination, instead a sociological analysis of anti-discrimination law, where we see social practices acting upon other social practices, and then instead of talking abstractly, we can talk about what kinds of prejudice, what kinds of harms, what kinds of mistreatments should we root out. In addressing some of the most vexing issues of freedom, equality, personal responsibility, social pressure, democracy, judicial review, privacy, and dignity, Post invariably demands that we confront unpleasant realities while reaching for stirring aspirations. The roots of his approach can be traced to his work as a Harvard undergraduate and a PhD in American civilization here, so we claim him intensely for Harvard. And after all, he entitled his dissertation, and here it is, Studies in the Origin and Practice of the American Romance, Social Structure, Moral Reality, and Aesthetic Form. I think you've been writing that ever since, over and over, but with new insights. And like vigorous therapy, his work teaches that meta-principles abstracted from social practice cannot help resolve pressing and crucial legal questions. Instead, we need art. He's actually an amazing visual artist using digital tools. He also prescribes scholarship and teaching that not only tells but shows how to consider social meaning, how to engage arguments in context, how to make commitments in terms of values and hopes. And as a colleague, whether in friend of the court briefs to the United States Supreme Court or late-night mutual support through the journeys of mortality, otherwise known as being a dean, I cannot imagine a better, more caring, or more delightful friend. He is not only a professor, dean, colleague, and friend. His juggling is no act. His magic is no trick. His life is imaginative. His work is wise. His pursuit of human values will instruct us all. There could be no better lecturer here today. Join me in welcoming the one true Robert Post.
My goodness, after introductions like that, there's no place to go but down. So I just want to say what a pleasure and an honor it is to be here today to present the Tanner Lectures. It's really the culmination of one's professional aspiration. And as I was telling President Faust before, I feel like I'm doing it at the center of the intellectual universe. So thank you for that. And thank you, Homie, for having me. It's a great honor to be here. So today I'm going to talk about the issue of campaign finance regulation, which by any account is one of the most vexing issues of our time for those who want to push campaign finance reform. The stakes concern the integrity of the republic. For those who oppose campaign finance reform, regulations threaten to to suppress the freedom of speech upon which our democratic self-governance depends. And what's interesting about these arguments is that they seem to slide past each other without a moment of mutual engagement at all. And if you think about constitutional law as supposed to be the ground of common agreement upon which we can work out such controversies, it's a very depressing spectacle when the Constitution seems to contribute nothing to these mutually different opinions. So if you look at these cases, they begin in 1976 with a case called Buckley versus Vallejo. It was a compromise decision. It was universally condemned at the time. And the court has been sliding all over the map in its dealings with campaign finance ever since. The most recent such opinion, and certainly the most controversial, is Citizens United, which was decided in 2010. And in these lectures, I am going to be focusing my analysis on Citizens United, a very recent decision. The majority of the court in that 5-4 decision defends its suppression of campaign finance regulation on the ground that freedom of speech is at stake, and what could be more important than that? Justice Kennedy says, under our law and tradition, it seems stranger than fiction for our government to make political speech a crime. Yet this is the statute's purpose and design. So completely incomprehending of the opposite position in dissent for 4 justices, Justice John Paul Stevens says, with equal conviction, the court's ruling threatens to undermine the integrity of elected institutions across the nation. So there's 2 very vigorous opinions here. There's very little common ground. And there are a number of reasons for this disjunction, for the fact that the majority and dissent don't actually engage each other, some of which I'll talk about, some of which I won't. I will not talk about the political partisanship which is underlying this issue, because really I can't do much about that. But what I will suggest is that at least 2 reasons for this disjunction are, first, we have a very powerful and increasingly powerful jurisprudence of the First Amendment, but we don't know really what it means. We don't know why we have a First Amendment, and so the First Amendment tends to proliferate, as Fred Schauer used to say, like the tax code. We have endless rules. They're very stringent rules, but we don't know what they mean, and we don't know how to apply them. And so that's one side of the problem. That's the side of the majority. But second, on the other hand, when we try to justify campaign finance reform, we tend to put forward justifications like equality or distortion or corruption, which don't fit very well with any plausible account of First Amendment doctrine or First Amendment principles. And this disjunction, the inability on the one hand to articulate justifications that make sense within a world of First Amendment jurisprudence, on the other hand, the inability to make sense of our own First Amendment jurisprudence, these 2 factors are crucial in making sure that the majority and the dissent in these cases, and there's a line of them, and sometimes one side wins and sometimes the other side wins. The only certain thing is they don't talk to each other. And my hope in this Tanner lecture is to provide some common ground, some ground on which they can talk to each other, some principles to which they both might give loyalty, and so we can begin to get a more stable constitutional resolution of this very important issue of campaign finance. That's all I plan to do. I do not plan to give an agenda for practical reform. There are many in this room, like Pam there, who can do that far better than I. I do not plan to talk about how the politics can be changed. There are many in this room, like Larry, who can do that far better than I. I am simply going to try to give the foundations for a constitutional argument that might plausibly speak to both sides of this problem, and so do what constitutional law is supposed to do, which is to provide the common ground in which those of us who disagree can work together. So how can we do that? Well, the interesting thing to notice, if you look at the majority and the dissent in Citizens United, is they both come back to one idea, that of self-governance. Self-governance is a deep ideal or principle in the American tradition, but in our tradition it has taken 2 distinct forms. One is Republican self-governance, that is to say where you elect people and your self-governance happens through them, through representatives. And it has a second form, let's call it democratic deliberation. So in Republican representation, I elect a representative who speaks for me and in my name. And in democratic deliberation, I speak in my own name to other citizens, and together we forge a public opinion, and we expect the government to be responsive to that public opinion. And the majority of the court in Citizens United is speaking about this principle of self-government in the accents of democratic deliberation. So the majority opinion in Citizens United, as per Justice Kennedy, says, quote, "Speech is an essential mechanism of democracy, for it means to hold officials accountable to the people. The right of citizens to inquire, to hear, to speak, and to use information to reach consensus is a precondition to enlighten self-government and a necessary means to protect it." And the court derives from this notion, and the notion that campaign finance regulation regulates or suppresses speech, the fact that such regulation deserves strict scrutiny, which means that the government can only do it if it has a compelling purpose and is narrowly tailored to achieve that purpose. Now, the dissent in Citizens United equally speaks from the principle of self-governance, but it imagines self-governance not as citizens speaking to each other, but rather as a process of representation. It imagines that self-government happens when we elect representatives who then engage in the actual practice of lawmaking. So it is of crucial importance for the dissent, quote, "to assure that elections are indeed free and representative, because in a functioning democracy, the public must have faith that its representatives owe their positions to the people and not to the corporations with the deepest pockets." And the dissent associates this faith with, quote, "compelling governmental interest in preserving the integrity of the electoral process." So for the majority, the crux of the issue is the relationship between people and each other through a process of communication. For the dissent, the crux of the issue is the relationship between people and their representatives through processes of election. That's how this conflict gets configured. Now, I've been teaching First Amendment now, I would say, 35 years, dare I say, and I find I've always avoided teaching the campaign finance regulation cases because I really have not had a clue about how to resolve this conflict, about how to think about how these deep differences in the conceptualization of the principle of self-government ought to be resolved. But in these lectures, I'm going to take a leap. I'm going to make an effort to develop some principles that might speak to both the majority and the dissent, and I'm going to do it in 2 parts. In this lecture today, I'm going to try to do a very brief, very stylized, very quick history of the concept of self-government in the United States and show how self-government evolves into systems of representation and evolves into systems of democratic deliberation. What is the connections for that? Because from this history, we can derive some very good ideas of what First Amendment rights are designed to do. And that'll be today's lecture. And then in tomorrow's lecture, I'm going to apply what we learned today from history to the actual case, Citizens United, and attempt to show you how you could rework that case in a much more constructive and helpful way. So that's the big picture of what I'll be doing in these lectures. So let me begin with the idea of self-government in the United States. Of course, it goes back. We have a revolution. We have a Declaration of Independence, which proclaims that governments instituted among men must derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Self-governance is the key to understanding our revolution and our Constitution. The people, we say, are in fact the fountain of all power. That's James Madison, or as James Madison says in Federalist 39, "It is evident that no other form would be reconcilable with the genius of the people of America than to rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-governance." So we want self-governance. The framers were aware of ancient democracies, democracies in which, in their view, a few people, because it would only be a few people, got together and they decided what to do among themselves. But they thought that such a democracy would be completely inappropriate for the United States. There were too many people. The spaces were too big. As John Adams says, the people could never act, consult, or reason together because they cannot march 500 miles, nor spare the time, nor find a space to meet. So how can the principle of self-government be translated to these shores? The great innovation, really, the great contribution that the Americans make to the idea of self-government is representation. Representation is, in Madison's words, the pivot on which the new Constitution would be built. It was to quote Madison again, "Representation is an expedient by which the meeting of the people themselves is rendered unnecessary." And so they mean to combine the principle of self-government with the principle of representation, so to create a form of government, to quote James Wilson, in which all authority of every kind is derived by representation from the people, and the democratic principle is carried into every part of government. That's the design of the new nation. Now, it's not obvious how one combines representation and self-government. Remember, by 1762 already, Rousseau had issued his critique of representation, saying, if you're going to govern yourself, the sovereign has to speak in its own name. It can't speak through somebody else's name. So he says the English people think they're free, but they're only free when they're voting for the members of parliament, and after that, they're slaves to parliament. So representation does not solve the problem of self-government. And the colonists had themselves direct experience with this problem. So, for example, when they are protesting British taxes, they're saying, remember the phrase, no taxation without representation. You can only tax me by my consent or the consent of my representatives. So this is what they say to the British, and the Brits come back and they say, what are you talking about? You are represented. You're representing the British Parliament. To which the colonists say, no, we're not, because we didn't vote for those people. They're not our representatives. If we don't vote for them, they're not our representatives. To which the Brits write back, a very important pamphlet by Thomas Whately in 1775, he writes back, what do you mean? 9/10 of the people of Britain don't vote for their members of parliament. Manchester, women, people without property, they don't vote. Surely they're represented. They're virtually represented, says Whately, a concept later to be developed by Burke. They're virtually represented in Parliament because Parliament represents everyone whom it governs. To which the colonists have to respond, how? By developing a theory of representation. But what is that theory of representation? The theory of representation is, how is it that your representative actually speaks for you? You need a substantive account of representation working as in such a way that your representative is in some way, metaphysical, political, cultural, whatever, speaking for you. How does that work? And so the colonists, in response to this dialogue with Great Britain, were forced to develop a theory of when representation actually works. And that theory turns on really two criteria. One is consent. You have to actually choose your representatives. So the Stamp Act Congress says, the only representatives of the people of these colonies are persons chosen therein by themselves. And the second, which is actually more important than choice, because of course women didn't vote in the United States for a long time, until 1919. The second is the notion of commonality of interests. So the critique of the British is they're governing for Brits, but what goes for a Brit doesn't go for an American on this side of the Atlantic. And so there has to be some form of commonality of interest between the representatives and those whom they purport to represent in order for representation to actually work. Right? So we're a nation founded on the problematic of what makes representation work, as in they're actually speaking for me. And when they came to found a government and to draft a constitution, the greatest difficulty, to quote Madison again, lies in the affair of representation. If this could be adjusted, said Madison, all others would be surmountable. And what the framers sought to do was to create a form of representation in which, to quote James Wilson again, there was a chain of communication. This is Wilson's words, a chain of communication between the representatives and those they represented that was sufficiently strong such that those who were represented could believe in the good faith and have sympathy between the rulers and the ruled. And throughout the drafting of the Constitution, they debated this question of how representation could work. They debated on the question of who would vote. They debated on the question of how frequent elections should be. They debated it over the question of how large a deliberative body there should be. They debated on the question of how large a size the electoral district should be. All of these were debated in terms of their effect on the system of representation and whether it would be real. And the critique of the Constitution by the Anti-Federalists was that it was reimposing a representation which, in the words, say, of Rollins Lowndes, who was an anti-federalist out of South Carolina, the representation, he says, of the Constitution is merely virtual, just like what we had under the Brits. You have people you call representatives, but they don't actually speak for us. The claim of representation fails. So I'm going to, in this lecture and then tomorrow, use the word representative integrity to denominate a system in which representation succeeds in terms of the value of self-governance. There is the relationship, the sympathy, the communion between the representative and those whom the representative purports to speak, for whom he purports to speak. If that relationship succeeds, I'm going to say that the relationship has representative integrity, okay, to denominate that. As they debated about representative integrity and what would create it or not create it at the founding, the founders were very much aware that they had to negotiate a line between, to use Hamilton's words, between despotism on the one hand and the extremes of democracy on the other. They wanted some way to have self-government that wasn't liable to objections which most of the founding, I would say most of the founding generation had against flat-out democracy. And the objections against democracy were that the people were fickle, the people's sentiments couldn't be trusted. The framers feared what they called the fury of democracy. They were apprehensive of, quote, the amazing violence and turbulence of the democratic spirit, which can seize the popular passions and spread like wildfire and become irresistible. So the solution to the problem of despotism on the one hand and democracy on the other was what they called a theory of representation. And representation solved the problem. It tamed the turbulence of democracy in a number of ways. Madison himself defines a republic as a form of self-government that occurs through representation. And when that happens, when you make the move to representation, the first point is you're electing somebody. Who are you electing? You're electing leaders. And who are the leaders? Leaders are those, this is Madison's words and, Federalist 10, the famous words, leaders can refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves convened for the purpose. That's Madison. And again, in Madison, in Federalist 10, Madison gives a second reason why a republic, a system of representation, is better. It allows for an extended sphere of governance. Why is an extended sphere of governance better? Well, if the more the people the more likely it is who vote, the more likely it is that the person elected will be a standout person. That is someone well known. We would say now more likely to be an elite. Madison put it this way. He said it's more likely in an extended republic that the suffrages of the people will be more likely to center in men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffuse and established characters. So when we see how republicanism and representation in the founding generation instantiates the theory of self-government, what we see in these passages is that the framers were working within a system of social hierarchy and deference. There were elites in 18th century America. Everyone knew who the elites were. The elites were chosen because they were standout, because they were persons of better character. Madison's words, the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established character. The larger the electoral districts, the more elite there would be. So there is a notion in which the framers embraced the idea that representatives would be different than the people. They would be better than the people. They were more likely to be elite. And this view was tested almost immediately in 1791 when the First Amendment is proposed to the First Congress by James Madison. Someone comes along and says, we want to amend the First Amendment. We want to have a provision in which the people can instruct their representatives how to vote. Because, of course, the representatives represent the people, so the people should be able to tell their representatives what to do. This view of representation is rejected in the Congress on the grounds that, to quote one congressman, representation is the principle of our government. The people ought to have confidence in the honor and integrity of those they send forward to transact their business. So this very notion that the representatives are elite, that they are not subject to instruction, they're not the delegates of the people, they're more like the trustees of the people. How then does the sympathy and communion between the representatives and the people get sustained? How does the relationship of representative integrity maintain itself when the people who are representatives are confessedly elite and confessedly refused to take instruction from the people. How did the framers imagine that that relationship would continue to have integrity, representative integrity? And the answer is quite simple. If you look at the early records, the answer is elections. The maintenance of sympathy and communion between representatives and constituents depended upon, to quote Madison, the right of electing the members of the government, which constitutes more particularly the essence of a free and responsible government. In the founding generation, to quote again, frequency of elections, this is what it was said in the Constitutional Convention, is the great bulwark of our liberty. The House of Representatives was constructed to be the people's house, the place where representatives of the people would congregate. The senators were elected by state legislatures, the president by electors. But in the House, it was the people's house. And the framers took great care to structure the elections in the House, to structure the number of members of the House, to structure the size of electoral districts, such that elections would serve this purpose of maintaining representative integrity, this necessary connection between representatives and the people who elected them. And this, whether the structures created in the Constitution were sufficient to do this, was a great object of debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. There's a debate between Madison and an Anti-Federalist named Brutus, which is quite interesting. In retrospect, Brutus, who's an Anti-Federalist, argues that if the people are to give their assent to the laws by person chosen and appointed by them, the manner of the choice and the number chosen must be such as to possess, be disposed, and consequently qualified to declare the sentiments of the people. For they do not know or are not disposed to speak the sentiments of the people do not govern, but the sovereignty is in the few. And there's a big debate between Brutus and Madison about whether the structure of elections every 2 years, whether the number of constituents, 50,000, would be enough, would be close enough to create the necessary sympathy such that the representatives wouldn't be speaking for themselves. They wouldn't be an elite governing for an elite, but would speak for the people who voted for them. And I could go on and on and on about that debate, but I'm just going to cut to the chase because of time constraints and say what we can take away from this debate and use for our purposes in understanding a modern issue like Citizens United is what Madison and Brutus agree upon. They agree that the issue of representative integrity is a contingent question. It can come, it can go. It's not a matter of, not a principle. It doesn't happen by formal institutions. It happens because the institutions are structured in a way to make it happen. It's contingent, and it's contingent upon institutional structures. And all of the framers believed in those two propositions. And eventually the debate between Madison and Brutus is settled by the ratification of the Constitution. And what we get is a system, a very interesting political system in which we have self-governance, but self-governance through a representative system that is keyed to elites. When the framers make separation of powers, as Hamilton theorizes quite explicitly in the Federalism Papers, separation of powers is supposed to give the time for elites to think through and solve problems independent of immediate popular control, the gusts of popular passion and sentiment which might otherwise throw the ship of state, I'm going to mix a metaphor, off its tracks. So that's where we are as of the end of the framing generation, and then along comes Tocqueville. We have, all of a sudden, we have the collapse of the system of deference and hierarchy. It's hard to overstate the significance of that for the United States. You have a system in which everyone knew who the elites were. Suddenly, in de Tocqueville's America, in Jacksonian America, everyone is equal to everyone else. And we have this completely new social setting. We have the collapse of the system of deference. Indeed, we have popular ressentiment on a large scale. And so the question is, how do we create representative integrity when we no longer have elites to choose among? That's the question that this poses for the Jacksonian generation. And the Jacksonians, of course, argued from an entirely different set of premises than the framers did. For the Jacksonians, I'm now going to quote a Jacksonian publicist, William Leggett. He writes, "For our own part, we profess ourselves to be Democrats in the fullest and largest sense of the word. We are strictly for popular government. We have none of those fears which some of our writers, copying the slang of the English aristocrats, profess to entertain of an unbalanced democracy. We believe in when government in this country shall be a true reflection of public sentiment. It is really true that popular intelligence and virtue are the true source of all political power and the true basis of government." Right? So you're egalitarian, so the elites are not the source, reason is not the source is popular sentiment, popular government, and institutions reflect this. Right? The Jacksonian era is the triumph of white male suffrage. We have universal male suffrage, white male suffrage at that time. And as a result, as de Tocqueville observes in Jacksonian America, the people are the real directing power, and although the form of government is representative, it is evident that the opinions, the prejudices, the interests, and even the passions of the community are hindered by no durable obstacles from exercising a perpetual influence on society. This whole thing is put best, I think, and most concisely by George Bancroft. He had a famous July 4th oration, 1826. He says, "The popular voice is all-powerful with us. This is our oracle. This, we acknowledge, is the voice of God." So for James Madison, the popular voice was not the voice of God. And the framers believed that representatives could have the trust of constituents because they would be persons of independent means, of public merit, established character, who could tame the unstable passions of the multitude. But that structure of representation could not survive the Jacksonian era. The Jacksonian era exhibits a faith in public opinion which is downright hostile, says de Tocqueville, to the intellectual authority of right reason. So as the manifesto of the Jacksonian Party, the United States magazine Democratic Review, writes in its first issue, it says, "The general diffusion of education, the facility of access to every species of knowledge important to the great interests of the community, and the freedom of press make the pretensions of those self-styled better classes to the sole possession of the requisite intelligence for the management of public affairs too absurd to be entitled to any other treatment than an honest, manly contempt." So, if representatives could no longer depend upon the respect and deference of their social inferiors, how could representatives maintain the trust and confidence of their constituents? What is going to sustain representative integrity in a world like that? Well, the role of representative becomes transformed, and they become much more like what Hannah Pitkin would call a delegate. You see Jacksonian after Jacksonian say, my role as a representative is to be transparent to the will of the people. I am here to do the will of the people because the people are God, and I am their voice in the Congress. That is how representatives imagine themselves as connecting to their constituents. I am your delegate here in Washington. And this takes us into a problem, of course, because the framers had created a whole complicated system of checks and balances. Why? Because they wanted to defer action so that the elites could contemplate and not be susceptible to popular passion. But now you have the public, the majority, being the voice of God, and the expectation is that the government was going to be responsive to the voice of God, to the voice of the people, but you have separation of powers which prevented it from being responsive. So the framers' clockwork constitution, which you have balances back and forth, is now at odds with an egalitarian world in which there isn't deference to the deliberations of the elite. And so you see hostility to separation of powers. In the Jacksonian era, President Jackson himself says this in his State of the Union, 1829. He says, "Experience proves that in proportion as agents to execute the will of the people are multiplied, there is danger of their wishes being frustrated. Policy requires that as few impediments as possible should exist to the free operation of the public will." So as we now know, of course, the framers' design was not a democratic design, it was a Republican design. So the framers' question was how you check public sentiment. The Jacksonian question is how you unleash what Bancroft calls the public power, how to make, now going back to the United States Magazine, how to make all dependent with equal directness and promptness on the influence of public opinion. The popular will should be equally the animating and moving spirit of them all, and ought never to find in any of its own creatures a self-imposed power capable of resisting itself and of defeating its own determined objects. Okay? So that's the political landscape we're in by, say, 1832. And now we have two problems. The first problem is, how do people identify which representatives speak for them? Right? The population is big. I don't know who the representative is. I don't have anything to defer to. It's not an elite. I'm as good as this representative. Why does this representative speak for me? That's a problem. How to make a connection, how to preserve the representative integrity in a world like that. And the second is, if government is to be legitimated by being responsive to the popular will, how can that happen when there's separation of powers? So I can elect my representative, but my representative acting alone can't make the government responsive to me because we have separation of powers and blah, blah, blah. So how does the government become responsive to me? How does the government maintain its its legitimation as self-government if we have separation of powers? And so this is a big problem, and the solution, the ingenious solution that the United States invents in the decade of the 1830s, is to create the first mass democratic national political party in modern history. Jacksonians invent mass mobilization parties, and parties solve a lot of these problems. But just to say, as the fact of the matter, by the end of Jackson's second term, we have Whigs and we have Democrats that are competing on platforms that we would recognize as political platforms with respect to the bank. And electors and voters vote for their representatives based on the platform, and they expect them to act in a certain way based on the party platform. So notice how the political party solves these two problems. First, I don't need to know my representative. What I need to know is which party does he belong to. I, as a voter, identify with the party platform, with what it wants to do, with its principles, and I know that a given representative identifies with that party, goes along with its principles, and that's the connection between me and the representative. So representative integrity becomes a problem that's mediated by the political party as of the 1830s in the United States. And notice, as Woodrow Wilson pointed out very cleverly in 1908, parties are extra-governmental. So they can be unified. And even if we have separation of powers, if all the voters vote for the same party, there can be unified policy across the branches if the party controls all the different branches of government. So the party, being an extra-governmental entity, can make the entire government responsive to the wishes of the electorate. And so we create a system in which the problem of representative integrity, of self-governance, which the framers solved through systems of deference, is now mediated through the institution of the political party, the invention of the political party. This becomes rapidly institutionalized such that, for example, in the early 20th century, Robert La Follette, famous politician out of Wisconsin, could say that the voter, I'm quoting him now, gives support to that party which promises to do the specific things that he regards of the highest importance to the state and to the welfare of every citizen. Upon its promise and his support, the party has become the custodian of his political rights. The party is bound to keep its pledged word. This measures its value as a power for good in representative government. So upon this pledge of the party, representative integrity resides. And this notion of partisan identification continues in the United States up until 1896. And it's interesting that it continues even though parties are no longer ideological parties of the kind, they say, that Jacksonian Democrats were. By the time James Bryce comes to the United States in 1888 and he's looking at the different parties, he says, these are two organizations that are not different by principle. Democrats and Republicans in the 1880s, they're there competing for office. And they're two big tribes competing for their members to get political office, to get the spoils of office, but they're not principles. And yet, nevertheless, we know that throughout the Gilded Age, there was extremely strong partisanship, there was extremely strong party identification, and we're not really exactly sure historically what makes it up. We think it has something to do with ethno-religious identification or the distribution of resources to particular individuals and groups. We know if we look at George Plunkett in Tammany Hall, he says, it's his belief that argument and campaign literature have never gained votes. We gain votes by providing services, not by having a platform that has principles. This party identification is so strong that if you're a third party, or if you're not a member of Republican and Democrat, you begin in the 1880s, 1870s, 1890s to lose faith in representative government altogether, because there's no way that representative government can speak to you. It only speaks to you through the mediating mechanisms of one of these larger parties. So this formation is very stable in the United States until the end of the 19th century. And then, for reasons, again, which are not entirely clear or obvious historically, but we know that it happens, it collapses. So to quote the historian Robert Wiebe, between the 1890s and the 1920s, the lights dimmed in the great showcase of 19th century democracy, the extraordinary public outpourings to electioneer and to elect. In national contests, turnouts declined from about 80% of the eligible voters in 1896 to about 50% in 1924. And then to turn to a political scientist, Walter Dean Burnham, he says, as turnout declined, a larger and larger component of the still active electorate moved from a core to a peripheral position, and the hold of the parties over their mass base appreciably deteriorated, causing a revolutionary contraction in the size and diffusion in the shape of the voting universe, affecting both national and state levels. So we see decline in levels of partisanship, we see decline in partisan loyalty, we see decline in suffrage and voting, in participation in elections. Some of that is deliberate. We see the disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South, we see voting tests in the North of literacy tests, poll tax, other sorts of things. But the deeper point, and the point which is crucial for the story we're telling now, is that faith in the political party collapses. Parties are no longer seen as mediating between me and my representative. Parties are seen as machines that exist to extort money from corporations and to serve the interests of their own members. And this, in turn, leads during the Progressive era to, now to quote F.N. Judson in his presidential address to the American Political Science Association, 1908, a growing distrust of the representative system whereon both federal and state governments are based. As president of Harvard, Lawrence Lowell, writes in 1914, the American people are drifting toward a general loss of faith in representative government. One of the most universal causes of complaint is the tendency of legislative assemblies to play party politics instead of regarding purely the welfare of the whole community. The key to this collapse, in my view, is the conversion of parties from common instruments of principle into machines that are there and understood to be there to serve their own ends. And in conceptualizing this distinction, the work of J. Allen Smith is The Spirit of American Government is, I think, the classic work. He says, look, if you look at a party platform, it cannot be the case that parties are judged by their ability to enact their platform, because separation of powers means that the platform is going to be meaningless once they're elected. So the platform exists just to get voters to vote. And it's a kind of tease. So what are parties really doing? Parties are really extracting money. They're servicing their own many, many members. There are lots of members of political parties, and they're getting it from corporations for whom they are giving the favors of governmental patronage and governmental legislative help. And so the parties exist for their own benefit, but not for the voters. And Smith's analysis here exemplifies the larger turn that the United States takes during the era of progressives. Progressives had the insight, in Richard McCormick's words, that businessmen systematically corrupt politics. Key here is business and systematic. It's not just a few bad apples. The business of business corrupts politics, and it does it systematically. As Albert Shaw writes, there is not one of our states which has not, to a very considerable extent, come under the baneful influence of this system, by means of which the political life of the people is dominated and exploited for the private ends by rich working corporations in alliance with professional party politicians. The famous sociologist Edward Ross, lays down this basic principle. I'm going to read his quote at length because it's worth hearing. He says, the force devoted to wresting government from the people will correspond to the magnitude of the pecuniary interests at stake. The incentives to undermine popular sovereignty grow precisely as does the magnitude of the interest affected by the action of the government. The railroads want to avert rate regulation and to own the State Board of Equalization. The gas and street railroad companies want the authorization of 50-year franchises and immunity from taxation of franchises. Manufacturers want the unrestricted use of child labor. Mining companies dread short-hour legislation, and so on and so on. Right? Everyone has a political benefit they want to extract from the system. The party is the broker. You pay the party gets you the political results. That's how progressives viewed party. Right? And so they had a two-pronged approach to that problem. The first approach is they're going to regulate business, but they're not going to regulate business through politics, because politics are corrupt. They're going to regulate business through administration, and as Woodrow Wilson writes in 1887, administration lies outside the proper sphere of politics. Administrative questions are not political questions. Although politics sets the tasks for administration, it should not be suffered to manipulate its offices. Right? So the idea is we're going to create a sphere that's non-political. Just like the framers, we're going to give it to experts. So progressives, like the framers, go back to the notion of an elite, here an elite of an administrator, that wouldn't be subject to political to and fro. That's how we're going to solve the problem of business. Notice when the Jacksonians were worried about business corruption, their solution was get government out of the business altogether of doing anything, of regulating. The progressives couldn't do that because the massive consequences of industrialization had rendered that solution unavailable to them. So that was their solution vis-a-vis business, but our attention is now on their solution vis-a-vis politics. So what do you do there? So they had a many-pronged attack. One prong is you stop the flow of money into politics. And in fact, there are many statutes enacted during the progressive era that are the ancestors, the direct ancestors of the statute considered by the court in Citizens United that prevent corporations from giving money to politics. I'm going to quote to you now from Elihu Root, who's a conservative of unimpeachable stature. This is at the Constitutional Convention of New York in 1894. He says, "The idea is to prevent the great moneyed corporations from furnishing the money with which to elect members of the legislature of the state in order that those members of the legislature may vote to protect the corporations. It is to prevent the great railroad companies, the great insurance companies, the great telephone companies, the great aggregations of wealth from using their corporate funds directly or indirectly to send members of the legislature to these halls in order to vote for their protection and the advancement of their interest as against those of the public. It strikes at the constantly growing evil in our political affairs, which has, in my judgment, done more to shake the confidence of the plain people of small means in our political institutions than any other practice which has ever obtained since the foundation of our government." That's very strong language from someone who has the equanimity of Elihu Root, but these statutes are enacted across the country. They're in the platform of Theodore Roosevelt when he runs for president as a progressive, etc. So one tack is stop the flow of money from business into politics, but there's a whole other set of progressive initiatives. These are all addressed to the political party, because the political party is viewed as having the chokehold on politics and being irredeemably corrupt, a machine. Politics is a machine politics. Think Tammany Hall. So how do you get around that? What you do is you have a direct election of senators. You don't give it to the party people in the state legislature. You have a direct primary in which the people themselves, instead of the party caucuses, can pick who you're going to elect. And of course, you create the signature institutions of the progressive era, the initiative, the recall, the referendum, etc., all the people speaking directly. Now, in all of these contexts, progressives expressed their distrust in representative government. They wanted the people to speak in their own voice. And they hoped to break the rigor of the party system, the strangle, by being able to circumvent representation altogether and speak as the people, to speak without the intervention of parties who would distort the message of the public. In Richard Hofstadter's famous Formation, progressives, quote, wanted to bring about direct popular rule, break up the political machines, and circumvent representative government. Now, this effort should have about it, for all of you, a certain pathos, because how do you actually escape from representative government? Every time you have a direct election of a senator, the senator is your representative. Every time you have a direct primary, you're electing somebody who's going to represent you. And it's true, we can have the initiative and the referendum, but they can't do the day-to-day business of government. You know, at most, they can be intermittent mechanisms to do X or Y, but the day-to-day business of government is not going to be conducted by a town meeting and not going to be conducted by initiatives or referenda. So we come back to the problem where we started. How do we assure representative integrity? In a world in which the party is no longer mediating the relationship between me and my representative, how is it that the representative speaks for me? How do we solve that problem? And it's in the way that the progressives solve that problem that we see the origins of a case like Citizens United, because the progressives developed a solution to that problem which transforms our constitutional landscape, really changes everything in the way in which we imagine democracy in the United States. And they did it in a way that was so quiet and so indirect, but so consequential that we now accept the implications of the progressive solution as if it had no history, as if it had no motivation, as if it existed all the time. So what was the progressive solution? Well, Americans had known about public opinion, of course, since the founding. James Madison had very many shrewd things to say about public opinion. De Tocqueville imagined public opinion as, quoting him now, an enormous weight that bears upon the mind of each individual. It surrounds, directs, and oppresses him. And this arises from the very constitution of society, much more from its political laws. This same sense of public opinion as oppressive influenced the early John Stuart Mill, made him kind of anti-democratic, although the later John Stuart Mill makes a move that is similar to the move that the progressives make. We see this move first in the United States in the work of James Bryce, who's an Englishman who comes here in the 1880s, very, very shrewd observer, should be up there with de Tocqueville. He looked at public opinion in the United States, and he said, in no country is public opinion so powerful as in the United States, so much so, says Bryce, that the United States should be called, quote, a government by public opinion in which the will of the people acts directly and constantly on its executive and legislative agents. And Bryce observes, quoting him, government by popular opinion exists where the wishes and views of the people prevail, even before they have been conveyed through the regular law-appointed organs and without the need of their being so conveyed. He conceded that it was hard to know what public opinion was, but he writes that, nevertheless, public opinion can reign because everybody in government is trying to figure out what public opinion is and being responsive to whatever they interpret it as being. And he also noticed that although public opinion declares itself legally through elections, it is at work at other times also and has other methods of declaring itself. He says elections are, quote, only an intermittent mechanism, whereas public opinion is, quote, constantly active and in the long run can exercise a great and growing influence. But most importantly for our purposes, Bryce sees that public opinion can be an instrument of self-governance. And to see that, he had to reconceptualize public opinion from the oppressive medium that's in de Tocqueville and in the early Mill, and he sees it as a way in which people can take control of their own lives. So Bryce writes that that the habit of breathing, as well as helping to form public opinion, cultivates, develops, trains the average American. It gives him a sense of personal responsibility stronger because more constant than exists in those free countries of Europe where he commits his power to a legislature. And in contrast to de Tocqueville, Bryce imagines participation in public opinion formation as liberating. He says the average American has a sense of ownership in the government, and therewith a kind of independence of manner as well as of mind, very different from the dismissiveness of the humbler classes of the old world. Right? So this is a crucial moment in the history of American self-governance because in this notion that by participating in public opinion formation, you can get a sense of ownership of the government, you are now creating that relationship, that communion of interests and sympathy of sentiments, which can undergird the notion of representative integrity. Because if I elect my representative through a process of public opinion and if I participate in public opinion and the representative is responsive to public opinion, then there is a relationship between me and the representative. It doesn't have to be mediated by the party. It's a relationship that's mediated by this new notion of public opinion as an active medium in which we are all trading and all participating and to which the government can be responsive. And progressives pick up on this notion of public opinion as a way to solve the problem of representative integrity. You don't need a party. So if you look at John Dewey and his notion of the public and public opinion, it's all about participating in public opinion formation and making the government responsive to public opinion. Now, there are many progressives who do this, but I want to talk in detail about one, and then I'll close, because in this man's work, we will see many of the tensions which will arise in Citizens United tomorrow. I'm going to talk about Herbert Croly, who was the editor of the New Republic and a major force among progressives in the United States. And it's he who thought most deeply about the relationship between public opinion and representative government. So Croly stresses the distinction between the electorate and the people. He says, an electorate is necessary because in a democracy organized for action, some agency must be provided to decide what immediate action is to be taken. But he says elections are neither the beginning nor the end of a democracy. He says the finality of any particular decision must not be taken too seriously. The decisions of an electorate are frankly tentative and revocable. The really effective sovereign power is to be found in public opinion, and public opinion is always in the making. It is always, that is, essentially active. Its sovereignty is wholesome insofar as its activity is determined by a sufficiency of information, the ability to understand and face the really pertinent facts, and has real integrity of purpose. Now, in the old days, you couldn't have direct democracy and participation because you had to gather together and you had to talk to each other, and we're too big to fit in this room, so how are we going to do that? Croly says with modern techniques of communication, we can actually get together and govern ourselves because the structures of communication have changed. So he writes that modern communication has enabled people to keep in constant touch with one another by means of the complicated agencies of publicity and intercourse which are afforded by the magazines, the press, and the like. The active citizenship of the country meets every morning and evening and discusses the affairs of the nation with the newspaper as an impersonal interlocutor. Public opinion has 1,000 methods of seeking information and obtaining definite and effective expression, which it did not have 4 generations ago. And he says, under these conditions, the discussions which take place in a Congress or a Parliament no longer possess their former function. They no longer create and guide what public opinion there is. Their purpose, rather, is to provide a mirror for public opinion, to advertise and illuminate its constituent idea and purposes, and to confront the advocates of those ideas with the discipline of effective resistance and perhaps the responsibilities of power. So, what do we have here? We have a picture in which public opinion can create a different way of realizing the value of self-government. And he calls this form of self-government, Croly does, direct democracy. That's the term he uses it, because it involves establishing a direct relationship between me, because I'm sitting down with my newspaper and being part of public opinion, and the government. So it's not Republican, it's not through representatives, it's democratic. It's me to the public opinion, to the state. And he realized very quickly that this form of self-government requires a participation in the formation of public opinion. And insofar as direct democracy requires continuous participation in the formation of public opinion, it is incapable of any sustained action other than being educational, of being its own ultimate social cohesion through popular intelligence, sympathy, and faith. And they therefore saw that direct democracy couldn't displace representative institutions, and that there was a need, quoting him now, for some method of representation which would be efficient and responsible enough to carry out a social policy. But he was clear that public opinion could, quoting him now, never delegate its own ultimate discretionary power to any body of men or body of law. So the conclusion that he reached is that America needed, quote, both an efficient system of representation and an efficient method of direct popular supervision. He says the two different methods of government are supplementary and mutually interdependent. Direct government has come to stay and is entitled to stay, but it cannot dispense with the use of representative agencies. And so the challenge, he says, of the nation is to structure, quote, the phases of the relationship which ought to obtain between direct and representative government. So notice how elegant this solution is. It solves the challenges of representation. I can come to identify with my representative because I am participating in a public opinion to which the representative is also responsive, so it's like a party platform, so to speak. And second, public opinion operates on the whole government, so like the party, it can provide unified government response and thus overcome the problem of separation of powers. If we look more closely and deeply at Croly's thought, however, we can see that it disaggregates into separate logical strands, and this is now becoming the crucial analytics that I'll use tomorrow. So on the one hand, a public opinion functions in Crowley as a method of solving the problem of representational integrity, representative integrity, because it allows me to identify with my representative. But on the other hand, the minute he started focusing on public opinion, he began to see that I don't need the representative there at all. I can make government directly responsible to me. And so Crowley begins to use this concept of public opinion to imagine forms of self-government which are not Republican, which are, to use his language, democratic, right? And sometimes when he talks about democratic self-governance through the mechanism of public opinion, he means that the public, through public opinion, can act directly in an unmediated fashion without an intermediary. It can make itself law. And the example of that is the initiative. So public opinion decides it wants to have 3 strikes and you're out in California. It passes an initiative. It does it. You don't need any representational anything in order to do that. But sometimes when Crowley speaks about direct democracy, he means something else by public opinion. He means the capacity of the people to participate in what he calls an essentially active public opinion that is always in the making. And when he refers to direct democracy in that context, he's not referring to any government action at all. He's referring to communicative processes through which an ever-changing population articulates its ever-changing experience. Now, from now on, in this lecture and tomorrow, I'm going to use the term direct democracy for the first sense. That is to say, when the public acts directly through public opinion and without the need for a representation. So when it acts. And I'm going to use the words discursive democracy to describe public opinion in the second sense, that is to say, as an ongoing process that is always in the making. So direct democracy is very familiar to students of progressivism. It's exemplified in institutions like the initiative and the referendum. But what's interesting about it is that direct democracy can only act in intermittent ways. You can pass 5 initiatives a year, but the day-to-day work of government is going to be done in representative institutions that we elect according to representation, right? Direct democracy can't displace representative government as an ongoing means of connecting me to my government. But if we think instead of discursive democracy, it can. So discursive democracy is a little tough to get your mind around it, but think of it as a process that's always in flux. Think about it as like Heraclitus' river. You can never dip into it twice in the same spot. And in that context, if you think about it that way, public opinion, this ever-flowing stream, surrounds government in just the way that Bryce talked about. It's a muffled voice. It's indirect. You can never know exactly what it's saying because it is never represented. This public opinion is always moving, so there is no definitive representation of what it is. It cannot act, but it can surround, it can influence, it can make government officials always puzzle about what is public opinion thinking. Although it isn't one thing or another, but they're always thinking, what does public opinion mean here? And by participating in that public opinion formation, I can imagine a relationship in which the government is always accountable to me, because I'm always participating in the public opinion, and as Bryce told us as early as 1888, the government is always listening to public opinion. And I can therefore, in Bryce's words, take ownership of my government by participating in this public opinion. Now, this notion of taking ownership of the government through participating in public opinion, I'm going to use the terms democratic legitimation to describe that. Democratic legitimation is when, by speaking and participating in public opinion formation, I imagine that the government is being responsive to me and hence democratically legitimate with respect to me. Herbert Crowley, like almost all progressives, was very comfortable with the idea of direct democracy. He could imagine initiatives, he kind of liked initiatives, and so forth and so on. But he, just like every progressive of the pre-war generation, couldn't really get their minds around the notion of discursive democracy. And why was that? Because like most progressives, they were concerned with democracy in action. They wanted action. But in discursive democracy, public opinion doesn't act. It's always evolving, it's always changing, it's always in flux, but it's never stands still enough to be represented as this versus that, and therefore to act. And that is not an idea with which Crowley was, I mean, he said it, I read you passages in which he said it, but he couldn't quite get the theoretical implications of that. And if it is for that reason, I think, that the progressives pre-war progressives never asked themselves, okay, let's suppose we have direct democracy. Let's suppose public opinion is acting. What makes that action a legitimate representation of public opinion? How do we know that that's really public opinion as opposed to somebody speaking for the public? That's not a question the progressives asked themselves because they never really got into this notion of discursive democracy, which is about that, which is how is it that the ongoing formation of public opinion acquires democratic legitimation. If you think about that question, you will come, I think, very rapidly to the conclusion that public opinion can be legitimate depending on the purposes for which we want to use it. If we want to invest public opinion with democratic authority, then we have to accept, let's say, what Jürgen Habermas tells us. He says, popular sovereignty withdraws into democratic procedures and the demanding communicative presuppositions of their implementation. So the procedures by which public opinion is formed invest it with the authority to do one thing or another, to give us democratic legitimation or to decide for us in direct democracy. All of this is going to come from how we're going to use public opinion. So to understand public opinion as legitimate, we need to know what its authority is, and then how do we ensure that public opinion will have that authority? We create communicative rights which guarantee that public opinion will have the kind of authority that we want to use it for. So communicative rights tell us what it means to form public opinion. Communicative rights allow us to say public opinion is now formed in such and such a way that we can count on it as being a legitimate whatever, whether it's democratic or direct or otherwise. So one reason Crowley and the pre-war progressives didn't go there is that they were anti-constitutional rights. Like all progressives, they were fighting the Supreme Court in Lochner. They thought constitutional rights were dreadful. They wanted a pure expression of the public will. They were entranced with the idea of a pure, unmediated expression of the democratic will. They didn't want to go into this process of how is that will legitimated, hence constitutional or communicative rights. Rather, they stayed with this image of the will itself. And that was very attractive pre-war. But as the 20th century progresses, and the unobstructed celebration of the public will, of the popular will, as the triumph of the will becomes more visible in fascist regimes, this attraction grows, let's say, less and less. And the movement toward communicative rights for those who care about public opinion becomes more and more prominent. And this moment happens in the United States with World War I. And the reason it happens in World War I is, for the first time really in our history, we have this massive manipulation of public opinion, both through censorship and through propaganda, very deliberate propaganda. And suddenly the progressives are saying, well, we have all this faith in public opinion, but how do we know it's a public opinion worthy of the name? That's the language of Frank Cobb, who was the editor of the New York World. How do we know that? Well, suddenly they begin to say, well, we know it because you have a right to participate in public opinion. That's how we know it. But of course, the interesting point, there were no rights to participate in public opinion. Because it's exactly at this time, exactly at the time that many progressives are turning toward a notion of communicative rights, that the Supreme Court, for the first time in our history, recognizes something like a First Amendment right. That may come as something of a shock to you, I know. First Amendment is ratified in 1791, but before, say, the 1930s, there are no Supreme Court decisions protecting First Amendment rights. And there are almost no decisions among state courts protecting communicative rights. The invention of the First Amendment landscape as we know it, as we see it enforced as though it were the most obvious thing in the world in Citizens United, that notion of a communicative right emerges at precisely this time in World War I, when public opinion comes under threat of censorship and manipulation by the state, by now the modern administrative state, and people are saying, whoa, if we're going to trust the public opinion, we have to actually protect public opinion, hence constitutional rights. The first opinion at the Supreme Court level, ever before that, First Amendment was understood to mean really the Blackstonian right, no prior restraint. no prior, you can't stop speech before it's written, you don't need a license before you publish. It is only the first time you see a Supreme Court justice even think about the idea of a First Amendment right is the dissent in Abrams in 1919, November 1919, by Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he speaks, of course, as the marketplace of ideas, and moderns have cashed this out, and it's kind of a market. It's really not a marketplace. He's speaking about democracy and how you make your best choices in a democracy. He's speaking in the tradition of pragmatism, where James talks about the cash value of an idea. He's not really talking in modern law and economics terms at all. But the first justice actually to theorize the connection between the protection of communicative rights and self-governance, which, as you can see, is really the origin of these rights, is Brandeis. And he does that in this little known but actually surpassingly brilliant opinion in 1920 in a case called Gilbert versus Minnesota. Brandeis, in dissent, writes, "The right of a citizen of the United States to take part for his own or the country's benefit in the making of federal laws and in the conduct of the government necessarily includes the right to speak or write about them, to endeavor to make his own opinion concerning laws existing or contemplating prevail, and to this end to teach the truth as he sees it. Were this not so, the right of the people to assemble for the purpose of petitioning Congress for a redress of grievance or for anything else connected with the powers or duties of the national government would be a right totally without substance. Full and free exercise of this right by the citizen is ordinarily also his duty, for its exercise is more important to the nation than it is to himself. Like the course of the heavenly bodies, harmony in national life is a resultant of the struggle between contending forces. In frank expression of conflicting opinion lies the greatest promise of wisdom in governmental action, and in its suppression lies ordinarily the greatest peril." Now notice, I'm just going to say several things about this opinion. First, notice that he is imagining freedom of speech as a pathway to self-government, plainly. Second, he's doing that because freedom of speech allows each person to participate in the formation of public opinion concerning, this is fascinating language, concerning, in Brandeis's words, to endeavor to make his own opinion concerning laws existing or contemplating prevail. Notice what's missing there, representation. He's imagining a direct relationship between public opinion formation, governmental action, and individual speech. And he says, so long as the government is responsive to the vector of the resulting contention of forces within public opinion, the government will be democratically legitimate, which is why it's more important to the government that you speak than to the individual citizen, because democratic legitimation is supremely important value in our democracy. And 7 years later, of course, in his famous concurring opinion in Whitney, the masterpiece of all First Amendment opinions, Brandeis elaborates these views. He says First Amendment rights are essential to an effective democracy. Notice democracy, not republic. Republic has slipped out of this. He says those who won our independence believe that public discussion is a political duty and that this should be fundamental principle of the American government. And it's upon the foundation of these Brandeis opinions that the Supreme Court of the United States, beginning in the 1930s and not before, begins to develop the First Amendment jurisprudence that we now accept as if it started in 1791, which of course it didn't. So in the spare prose of Chief Justice Hughes's magnificent opinion in Stromberg, which is really the first opinion to think this way, 1931 opinion as opposed to dissent, Hughes says, the maintenance of the opportunity for free political discussion to the end that government may be responsive to the will of the people and that changes may be obtained by lawful means, an opportunity essential to the security of the republic, is a fundamental principle of our constitutional system. And in the 80 years since Stromberg, we have seen First Amendment doctrine founded on the premise, quoting, I'm just going to give you a pastiche of quotes because it's easy to do this, that speech concerning public affairs is the essence of self-government. The court has repeatedly emphasized that the First Amendment exemplifies, quote, a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. Speech on issues of public importance occupies the highest rung of the hierarchy of First Amendment values and is entitled to special protection because discussion of public issues and debate on the qualification of candidates are integral to the operation of the system of government established by our Constitution. So we, in America, we have interpreted our First Amendment to protect speech so that people can enjoy the value of self-government, a value which we originally imagined through a system of representation that was mediated by the party, and when the party fails, we imagine public opinion as filling that gap. And so to understand the First Amendment rights that are enforced by Citizens United, particularly by Citizens United, we have to understand the way in which First Amendment rights are created in order to obtain the value of what I called in the earlier discursive democracy. And the court has been quite clear about that. Just to pick a case decided in 2012, rights protected by the First Amendment safeguard our nation's commitment to self-government by defining an open marketplace in which differing ideas about political, economic, and social issues can compete freely for public acceptance without improper government interference. Now, of course, we can debate about First Amendment rights all the time, and we do, and I do, and we say, how should the First Amendment be applied here or there? But the point is, the principle by which we resolve those debates ought to be whether it advances the cause of democratic legitimation. That's to say, do we need to protect this access to public opinion in order to maintain this supremely important value in our government of self-governance, that is the democratic legitimation. So when we argue about the application of First Amendment rights, we are arguing about how democratic legitimation can be sustained, and that's especially true in a case like Citizens United. And it's for that reason that we call routinely the First Amendment in our jurisprudence, we call the First Amendment the guardian of our democracy. So think how odd that is. We use the First Amendment to strike down democratic enactments. We use it to strike down ordinary legislation. So how can this thing which strikes down ordinary democratic enactments be the guardian of our democracy? Because these enactments have legitimacy precisely because they've been responsive to a public opinion, which it's the job of the communicative rights of the First Amendment to protect. So we take all this now for granted, more or less. We have since at least the 1930s, 40s. And so by the time that the court decides Citizens United in 2010, it doesn't ask, what are these rights for? It instead imagines these rights as rules which are just, like contract rules. I have a rule here, you can't discriminate on the basis of who the speaker is, or it's not a compelling interest to do that. It doesn't tell you why you have those rules. But we have now constructed a reason for these rules, which is very consonant with the reason that the dissent is trying to protect, namely representative integrity. And the tasks to which I'll turn tomorrow, you've been very patient, it will be to apply this form of reasoning to the First Amendment doctrine to see whether we can make some kind of accommodation between the demands of the dissent for electoral integrity and the demands of the First Amendment, which we have seen emerges in response to this ongoing challenge which Americans have faced in giving life to this ideal of self-government. Thank you.
So it is an extremely honor for me to be given the opportunity to comment on Professor Robert Post's, the first of his 2 Tanner lectures. And my task is, though, demanding, because I have no reason for disagreement, and I'm not good in pretending to be the devil advocate if I'm not. So it's, my task is demanding, because I actually sympathize with his goal of defending campaign finance reform and his argument that this is consistent with the purpose of the basic of First Amendment principles, which is, I quote, to make possible the value of self-government. Now, the issue of campaign finance reform is a vexata question in the US. Of course, disagreement is not something unusual or avoidable in a democracy. Democratic societies write constitutions and bills of rights because they foresee the possibility of dissent. Divisions on interpretation are among ordinary citizens and partisan politicians, but also among experts like judges and scholars. So in this specific case, disagreement points directly to the functioning of representative democracy as a system that I will call a diarchy, 2 basic sovereign power, diarchy of will and opinion, that is, of suffrage and political expression, as Post according to his vocabulary. This will be the guideline of my argument. But let me start with the disagreement inside of the court in the decision on Citizens United that Robert Post reconstructs so effectively. To Justice Anthony Kennedy, since private and corporate money in political campaign is free speech, state regulation would imply to make political speech a crime. To Justice Paul Stevens, instead, without some regulation, private and corporate money in politics would undermine the integrity of elected institutions. This division in the court reflects a radical polarization between two equally basic goods in representative democracy: free speech and the integrity of elected institutions. Post sees this polarization as a horrifying disjunction. His words: the consequence of a doctrinal approach to amend which he devises the following path of reasoning. I quote, state interest in campaign finance reform may be reconciled with traditional constitutional commitments if we show that the purpose of the First Amendment rights is to make possible the value of self-government, and that this purpose requires public trust that elections select officials who are responsive to public opinion. Post wants to redirect the jurisprudence on the First Amendment to take it away from doctrinal approach and make it seek coherent not with some abstract principles, but with the political and constitutional experience of US Republic. From metaphysics to historiography, it seems, in the hope to find the common denominator for solving this disagreement. This is an excellent point of departure, even if perhaps there is no guarantee that history is a less controversial terrain than theory. So this brings me to the topic of my comment, which is actually an attempt to translate Post's strategy into an interpretation of representative democracy as diarchia. My intuition is that if consistently pursued, post-historical reconstruction would make us go back to principles, those of representative democracy. Thus, theory is back, yet not as an exercise in doctrinal coherence to some principles, but as a development from within history, immanent to the process of representative democracy itself. Because if you go to see other democratic countries, the same situations reflects or emerges. So, immanent to the process of representative democracy, as the experience of American Republic shows. So the debate on the First Amendment shows that there is a need of rethinking the meaning of representative democracy. For many theorists, still this representative democracy is a second best in relation to the ideal of direct self-government. Only if we overcome this second best perspective, we can achieve an understanding of our government that can offer us, among others, a more secure path toward the resolution of this vexata question. Post writes that one was the principle upon which the US Republic was built, self-government. Yet, this principle was pursued in two different manners, as Republican representation and as discursive or deliberative democracy. This dualism is the ancestry of the vexata question we are dealing with today. Now, the main task of Post's lecture is devoted to reconstruct and critically analyze the manifestation of this dualism from the 18th century classical arguments in favor of electoral representation to the Jacksonian popular democracy and the strengthening of political parties, to finally post-World War I democratization with the emergence of public opinion as reappropriation of a direct link between citizens and institutions so as to bypass the mediation of political parties. And this is what we have today in continental Europe, with the democracy by the web, or web democracy as a way of bypassing political parties and going back to what I call a direct electoral democracy without parties. Now, in the path of Bryce and Brandeis and the American pragmatists Dew and Crowley, Post describes the public, ascribes to public opinion a quasi-sovereign role, but he introduces a crucial revision. Building on the intuition of Crowley and early reformers, Post suggests that representation of public opinion is necessary, but he adds that Crowley's intuition, or the progressive intuitions, on direct as discursive democracy versus representative republic is faulty, because does not see that something is needed for public opinion to remain continually in process. What is needed is that procedures are not suppressed by the temporary expression of political opinion. So, post-historical reconstructions contains an important theoretical argument which pertains to the very identity of representative democracy. His reading of the meaning of the First Amendment in relation to finance campaign regulation is consistent precisely with the diarchic nature of representative democracy. And indeed, in his second lecture tomorrow, he is explicit in endorsing this reading, and I quote, "Regulations on the franchise must comply with the logic of representation, whereas regulations of political expression must be consistent with the logic of discursive democracy." So the First Amendment pertains to the latter and is thus essential to the performance of the former. This is the meaning of what I call diarchy, the theoretical overcoming of the polarization between will or the franchise and opinion, which is still today basic in the court, as you said rightly. So let me say something briefly on diarchy. Since its ancient experience, democracy pertains to the equal opportunity of both sitting in the assembly, which is our franchise, and freely and frankly speaking in the assembly. Two rights. The Athenian citizens gave two different names to these two political rights, isonomia and isegoria. As for isegoria, they enjoyed and prized the right of free speech in the assembly, even if only they rarely used it, only some used it, and used it well or effectively. Concerning our societies, they are democratic not only because they have free elections and the opportunity to have more than one political party competing, but also because they allow effective political competition and debate among diverse and competing views, and finally, because elections make the elected an object of control and scrutiny. So the work of procedures require that the overall political system takes care not only of its formal conditions, franchise, but also the perception that citizens have of its effectiveness and values. Attention to democratic procedures asks for a continuous work of maintenance, whose aim is not to make voices equal, but to block the translation of social and economic inequalities into political power. This was also in Athens. This task, a self-governing task, is challenging because the insulation of political system should be achieved without blocking the communication between it and society. This is one of the most important features of representative democracy as diarchy. Diarchy of will and opinion applies in particular to representative democracy, a system in which an elected assembly is endowed with the ordinary function of making laws, not citizens. This assembly presumes and entertains a constant relationship with the citizens as single persons or political groups and movements, and opinions are the means through which this relationship develops. So, unlike direct democracy does, in representative democracy, voting compels citizens to be always more than voters, more than electors, to transcend the act of suffrage in the effort to reassess the relationship between their ideas and their votes through the time between elections. In direct democracy, thus, sovereignty is monarchic, because in it, opinions are identical with the will, since they translate immediately into decisions. But representative democracy breaks that unity because in it, opinions acquire a power of its own that is independent from, but equally important as voting. The challenge is that, although the franchise and opinion cannot be truly separated, they need to operate separately and be and remain different in the outcome. So that representative democracy is government by means of opinion entails that the public forum keeps state power under scrutiny and is public. Public both because the law imposes that it is performed under the people's eyes and because it is not owned by anybody, in agreement with the appointment by elections, which stipulates that political power does not belong in the category of property. So this criterion holds for both franchise and opinion. Indeed, as a twin sovereign power, the public forum requires being ruled, as Baker has written, according to the same egalitarian value that is embodied in people's equal right to be self-governing. The main implication of this diarchic perspective is that it makes the right to free speech and freedom of opinion an essential component of the political rights of the citizens, not simply a civil right of the individual. The right to take part in the formation of public opinion is a right that produces power, not only a right that protects from power. Hence, polarization between representative republic and discursive democracy is faulty. Democratic diarchy is equally distant from a pure electoralistic democracy and an interpretation of government by opinion as one in which sovereignty is in a permanent mobilization outside and above the voting procedures, like in a populist or plebiscitarian democracy. The diarchic argument counters both views that opinion is simply a matter of private right, and they view that wants it truly sovereign against the representative republic. Yet, of course, if the latter were true, if opinion were a sovereign in the same way in which voting is a sovereign power, this would make the most noisy citizens, or public debates in TV, or lobbies of polls, or powerful sponsors enjoy an unequal sovereign power. So in sum, the crucial insight of representative democracy as diarchy is that when opinion is introduced in our understanding of democratic participation, then government must attend to the question of the circumstances of opinion formation and expression, an issue that pertains to political justice and the equal opportunity citizens should have to meaningfully enjoy their political rights. Although influence can hardly be equal, and estimated with the rigorous calculations, this cannot be done, the opportunity to exercise it can and should be. So the same reasoning that holds for suffrage holds for opinion. Although we can hardly prove that voting translates into some desirable outcome, we don't conclude that to distribute it equally is meaningless. The same is with opinion. But let me conclude on this note by recalling the opinion devised in 2003 by Justice Stevens and Justice O'Connor when the Supreme Court approved the campaign finance law passed by Congress. Although the secret ballot prevents us from producing concrete evidence that money buys influence, the secret ballot is not a sufficient indicator of the status of democracy because presumably it is not the only form that the people's voice takes. In a word, opinion is a power both when it's used to advance a political program or sponsor a candidate and voice dissent with the opinion of the majority, or ask for more complete information on the government's practices, and when it's used to form, express, communicate ideas, and give them public weight and influence. This makes equal opportunity in partaking, the sovereignty of opinion, an issue of the First Amendment, although not identical in effectiveness and outcomes with the right to vote, of course. Robert Post makes thus an important contribution to the solution, in my view, of this vexata question, when he shows that the First Amendment is predisposed so as to protect the idea of representative democracy as diarchy. Although he doesn't use this theory, I think there is theory there. Through the reconstruction of the American political and constitutional history, he proves that the First Amendment iterates the normative value of democratic procedures in their impeccable ability to reproduce self-government. And finally, that a democratic government should feel the responsibility to regulate the public forum of opinions so as to ensure that all have at least an equal opportunity to exercise some influence on the political system, even if not all intend to use that opportunity, even if those who have more material power to effect political influence abstain from using it, is not enough to rely upon people's virtue, and even if elected politicians are virtuous enough to be deaf to the pressure of influential citizens. For this reason, we need precisely the solution of that vexata question. Thank you.
It's late. I don't need to talk. Just open up. Yeah.
Robert Post will respond through the question and answer process, so we'll open up straight away to questions. Please introduce yourself.
Noah Feldman from the law school.
We need louder.
Sorry, Noah Feldman from the law school. Robert, thank you. Characteristically brilliant and elegant synthesis of the history and the conceptual side. I wonder, though, if the two moments of transvaluation of representation that you describe don't have a follow-on in the post-war period, in which the pluralist interest group theory of democratic representation comes to be more powerful. And I wonder if that's true, if that doesn't explain something about the majority's position in Citizens United, which does have a kind of market-driven idea, which obviously grows out of the Buckley notion that money and speech are closely correlated or even perhaps the same thing. And if that's true, does that affect the normative picture that you're headed for tomorrow?
Well, I was desperately cutting the lecture, and one of the discussions in the printed version, the written version, is if you look at the contribution of the progressive era, among their many contributions is pluralism. I mean, Arthur Bentley's book is 1908, and Arthur Bentley, when he's creating the theory of pluralism, says what you have to do is go below the level of the political party to see the groups that are actually making demands on the government in order to understand the dynamic of American government. And I think the question that I closed with, which is, why is it that Citizens United sort of presumes that the First Amendment should take priority over electoral integrity. I mean, it simply says that. And the question is, why is that the case? And you might think that question's obtuse because the First Amendment is constitutional after all. But actually, we didn't read the First Amendment that way. So why do we read the First Amendment as taking priority over this really important factor of the integrity of the electoral system? And I think it's because of the understanding of American politics that emerges in the progressive era. That is, Americans participate in the political arena through groups that are parallel to the pluralist insight. If I want to influence public policy, I join the NRA or I join the ACLU, and I get together and I make a claim about what should and shouldn't be happening in the political arena. And in America, we expect our representatives to be answerable to these groups. We don't go make a claim on the political party particularly. We don't go through the medium of parties. We expect the government to be responsive in this larger general arena in which the different groups, call them interest groups, but they needn't be interest groups, or interests can be constitutive rather than merely material, in which these groups are playing out what should be done. And so it could be that the priority of First Amendment rights is as much due to the weakness of our party structure, which precludes representative integrity from having pride of place in self-government, as it is to anything more abstractly to do with the First Amendment and Congress shall make no law. And I think that's if that's true, it's going to be founded in precisely the moment of pluralism which you describe. Only I would put that back in the teens and the first decade of the 20th century. I think that's where these interest groups get founded as making claims on the government in some systematic way. And so I wouldn't say that's a post-war movement. I would push it back to the very formation in which the First Amendment gets founded. And the First Amendment is sensitive to that.
Martha Minow Law School. This elegant presentation particularly intrigues me with the use of the word integrity. But one thing that's interesting about integrity is that the consonants may come in two directions. So much of the talk imagines that the individual is looking for that consonance by expressing a preference or a desire. And yet, at various points, you acknowledge that the consonants may come in the other direction. The party may provide the job that makes the person loyal. The public opinion may be propaganda. And so I'd like to ask you to respond to that question really about the directionality of the influence, which I also take to be very much the burden of Professor Urbinati's comments. So where is this integrity produced? And the last bit of the question is legitimation here Habermas's view of the production of the appearance of legitimacy, or is it the more idealized version of it actually is legitimate because it actually does accomplish the goal for which it was intended?
These are questions I'm going to take up in some detail tomorrow, but as a preview, I would say, to me, what matters is people actually believe the government is legitimate. And so, therefore, it's ultimately founded in the subjective apprehension of legitimacy, and it's for that reason, actually, that First Amendment rights are typically subjective in nature. You know, I get to say what I want to say, not what you want me to say. And that link is a very important link. And also, I would say, I'm very much with the idea that the construction of integrity is always a two-way street. It's always a key in a lock. And it's never independent, one is never independent of the other. And so once you have this concept, tomorrow I'm going to make a big deal of the difference between direct democracy, which has a notion of public opinion which is representable, which is to say is knowable as a fact by statistics or by polling, versus discursive democracy, which is not, in which public opinion can never be represented and hence not known in that way. So if public opinion can't be known, then it's always a subject of, in Nadia's terminology, judgment or interpretation. And that means that we're always going to be going backward and forward. Did we get our judgment right? Because we can never know. We can't verify. We can't have the absolute surety of knowledge about it. It's always a prediction of whether we got it right or not got it right, like many things that matter in the world. So I would say that the integrity is an equilibrium point of these forces which are contending and which are struggling for the interpretation of what we, quote unquote, we think, because we're always thinking different things.
Yes, Frances Camp. Hi, how are you? Great talk, thank you. I wanted to ask about this division between public opinion and the vote, because you mentioned that people give diminishing significance to the suffrage, and we know that voting rates diminish, right? Now, the way you present public opinion as an alternative way of influencing legislators and getting things done, it could be an explanation for the demise of the vote. Because if there's this alternative mechanism by which you can actually influence, okay, then you get your policies without going to the polls. And this seems to be a disastrous effect, because one would have thought that the discursive democracy was really important for the formation of one's opinion before one goes into the voting booth, right? And not simply as a way of substituting for going to the voting booth. So there's this effect that I would like you to speak to, but if there is this effect, it's sort of at war with the view that what's very important for corporations is to elect a particular representative. That what they're doing is trying to influence public opinion or to get people to vote, for ultimately there is a vote of some sort, for a particular representative. This is where the threat of buying a vote comes in. Not so much through public opinion swaying a representative, but through the representative having been bought, elected, by certain forces. So I just want to know about the influence of the vote relative to the influence of public opinion and how this is working out in your, in the views of different people. As I say, I would have thought the ideal is discursive democracy for purposes of continually evaluating who you're going to vote for, how the person is performing, and so forth and so on, rather as an alternative to that mechanism.
Well, there's a Micheljohnian view of the First Amendment which says we talk to each other in order to inform our voting. And the way we speak back is by voting. But actually, the way in which the progressives or John Dewey would develop that, it's not simply voted, not simply concentrated on the vote. That's not the only method we have of speaking. And so we're continually contesting for what public opinion is in the way that Martha was just talking about. So we're contesting about that. And if you saw the metaphors of Bryce and of Crowley and of our own time, public opinion is enveloping the government, and the government is constantly attentive to it, not just in the election. Now, whether we vote less because we participate in public opinion more, I tend to think that's not a zero-sum game. Tomorrow, I will argue at the normative level that it shouldn't be and it can't be a zero-sum game because public opinion is never decisive. And we often need to be decisive. So the question is, where are we decisive? How is the connection between what we decide and public opinion maintained? That's the question I'm going to turn to tomorrow, which will allow us to mediate between these, what do you call it, the diarchy of voting and opinion. When you say that corporations want to buy elections, the best empirical evidence of which I'm aware, Sam Zakharov has done some of this studying, is that corporations prefer not to buy candidates, they prefer to lobby candidates once they're elected. So the spending is sort of different, and we have a competition for the influence on elected officials once they're there. And that has a lot of whole other implications about the relationship between public opinion and lobbying, which I'm not going to go into in these lectures, but very deep, and they don't just stop at the buying of an election.
Those issues, excuse me just a minute.
Yes, because it's not a vote. It's not represented. And so once you see, it is in the direct democracy, in the initiative, but it is not in the discursive democracy protected by the first, which is always a process. And so once we see that difference, we're going to see the difficulty of translating the norms of campaign finance reform into the norms of the First Amendment. It's that difference which makes it such a difficult translation process.
You can take up issues like that at the seminar on the third morning. Yeah.
Hi, Robert. A characteristically wonderful and thought-provoking talk. I had just a little question about so you start by saying in World War I there was manipulation by the government of public opinion, and this idea of the First Amendment has developed that the First Amendment is a way of protecting the integrity of public opinion. So there's an irony, maybe a problem, when the Supreme Court uses the First Amendment to invalidate a law that's arisen from public opinion. So my question is, how do you know that Congress isn't manipulating public opinion at that point? So, and in particular, I think this builds on Martha's question, there's a particular problem when Congress relates speech governing its own selection, right? There's a Bonham's case problem. There's a problem that Congress is being a judge in its own cause. And so does that play a role in the way we think about this transmission belt from public opinion into law and back into public opinion?
This is an argument that one sees often, which is we should distrust campaign regulation because it's incumbents trying to keep their own job. And so they're rigging the electoral system to keep themselves in office. And I really generically have nothing to say about that argument, except it's a danger, and one would want to be alert to it, but it's not the only danger on the scene. And until one is aware and can articulate what the other dangers are, one can't make a legal judgment about any particular effort to regulate campaign finance. So these are, tomorrow I'm going to shift gears from being an historian to being a lawyer and make arguments which will address the kinds of considerations you just put on the table, namely, should you have deference, what kind of deference, what dangers should you be alert to? Did this lead to ruling out the possibility altogether? How one addresses those complex of problems, which you quite rightly put on the table.
My name is Philip Fisher. I have a question. If we don't find ourselves in a limited perspective, if we start from the Constitution and therefore consider government to mean our national government. Because, of course, I'm a citizen of Massachusetts, I'm a citizen of Cambridge. Anyone who chooses, for example, to live in Wellesley versus southern New Hampshire versus Lexington is already choosing a whole set of concretized public opinion that is about education, about zoning, about many kinds of things that are not necessarily decided at the level of the national government. Point out, of course, that state governments led the way in changing slavery, in changing rules about marriage, in changing, for example, women's suffrage when Western states began that process. So that the idea that government here should uniquely, or public opinion should uniquely be thought about as it gets interpreted in national elections, in the decisions of the Supreme Court, the United States, and so on, that seems to me to cut short the larger action of democracy, so to speak. Which had as much division of powers by making me a citizen of many governments as it did in dividing that top government into three branches.
That's absolutely correct. So when we are talking about national constitutional rights, we typically are talking about rights which are incorporated against the states. You know, it was the case originally that the First Amendment applied only against the federal government, and not till it gets incorporated via the Due Process Clause into the 14th Amendment's restrictions on state action does the First Amendment begin to apply to states. And so this was a debate we had during the Warren Court days and in the First Amendment earlier, namely, when is it that we should incorporate a national right as against all forms of government, state and local, as well as national. And the floor process rights, like the First Amendment, very early on begin to be interpreted as against states. In fact, the first time that the First Amendment is applied against the federal government is not till the 1950s. That's the first time a federal statute is struck down under the First Amendment. So we have in the US, as you properly point out, very strong federalist values, which are values of decentralization. We want to have competing communities which have different structures of values, but we want to have enough the same so that we carry certain essential fundamental attributes of our national citizenship, whether you live in Massachusetts or you live in New Hampshire. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from coerced confessions are examples of those rights. And at the same time, we balance them against different democratic formations in these different states. And so how that balance is conducted that's a debate we had over what's in technical constitutional terms, it's called the incorporation debate. Which one should we interpret and in what way? There are many justices, like Justice Rehnquist, Justice Jackson, who held that the First Amendment should have a different meaning when applied against state laws than applied against the federal. But no one particularly takes that position now. It's interesting.
Could I request people to just come up and stand by the mic? So here, I keep going on like a bad conductor which is distracting for everybody. So I think the best thing is for people just to come and take their place at the mic and ask the questions from the mic. Thank you very much.
Hi, Yochai.
Given that it's here,
You have a privilege.
I have a
He's grandfathered Grandfather Benkler.
Yochai Benkler. So I want to ask you a different kind of question, I think. And it's about the role of the intellectual in a live political debate. So there's a version of the story you told, that goes something like this. Here are these two strongly held beliefs defended in the opinion in Citizens United on internally coherent grounds. And let me stand up and tell you a shared story of our constitutional history that will allow you to talk across it. And then you go through and you neutralize the political opposition by continuously reasserting the shared value of self-governance and how it replicates across time. There's another version, right? There's another version that's the version of the oligarchic power of money, the concentration of wealth, the post-Jacksonian homestead movement, and the effort to recreate a nation that is based in self-governance based on radical distribution of proprietary holdings. You can quote the same root quote that you give here, but carry that through, where essentially the role you play is a reconstruction of American constitutional history as a battle between different conceptions of the role of power, of money-based power, in the shaping of the democracy. Now, if you do that, what you're providing is a very different narrative. Instead of a narrative for elite professionals to hold hands and say, here we can move together, you're providing a narrative for mobilization around the question in the way that abortion becomes an electoral issue with regard to judicial politics, etc. Why is that not your role?
Well, the bottom line is I'm a very bad mobilizer. So I'm not good at that. It's not a talent that I have, first. But second, I actually do believe that this is a value shared. I believe if I had Tony Kennedy in that room and asked him, so why do you have First Amendment right? He would start speaking words that sounded in the value of self-government. He says them in the opinion himself. I do believe that in this instance, the constitutional landscape is not one of warfare. It's not one in which I can tell a story of, in which it's appropriate to tell a story in which what we have is a fundamental division. What we have, what I want to say we have, is a fundamental failure to communicate, which is its own kind of power. And if I succeed in convincing both parties like that, we can proceed forward in an enterprise which I think will have benefits to both parties. And so that's a legal way to do it. I could say there is no legal solution to this. The solution is political, hence we have to mobilize, hence we have to change the terms of the game. But and in the end, that may be what it is, because these divisions may not reflect reason. They may not reflect an attempt in good faith to interpret a shared tradition. They may reflect differences of power, and in which case, and if it fails to do that, there may be no recourse but to do what you suggest. But we can try this first.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Hochschild, the Government Department. So I'm going to ask you a question from the perspective of a political scientist. I'm not a legal scholar. And I want to pick up on kind of 2 points, one of which you said you weren't going to talk about, which is sort of partisanship in the court, or in the court system more generally. And the other was a sort of a throwaway line about how parties really aren't very powerful anymore. We kind of lost the 19th century sense of power. And I want to link partisanship to public opinion, which is to say there is a pretty strong argument, I think, within political science these days that public opinion is, in effect, partisanship. So the jargon is mediated reasoning, right? People don't actually think about policy issues or even think about politicians. What comes first and deepest and longest and primary is their partisanship. They start out as partisans, you know, they learn it with their mother's milk and so on. And so all of their opinions are developed through their party loyalty, their positions on individual candidates, their positions on essentially everything is about partisanship. So it's not parties necessarily as strong institutional actors, although there is a language, I mean, there is an argument that says parties are actually very powerful institutional actors within Congress or within, but that the effort to separate parties from public opinion doesn't work when you actually think about the nature of what opinion is and develops and plays out in the political arena. The second half of that question, I guess, has to do with the role of partisanship within the court. Again, Supreme Court maybe specifically, but maybe more generally, although I think the evidence is pretty clear that it matters much less in lower courts. If this logic of kind of mediated reasoning holds for public opinion, what justifies us in saying, not that we hope it doesn't hold in the court, but that it also, what justifies us in saying that it isn't equally true of Supreme Court justices?
Yeah, well, I mean, law in the sense in which I'm appealing to law is a faith that, you know, reason might win out. And if it doesn't win out, then there's nothing really to be done about it, right? Except we lose that bet. I don't think it's worth giving up that bet, you know? Now, and right, and with regard to your first point, I mean, I quite take the Nancy Rosenblum point about partisanship being extremely important in many ways to identity. I think if you look at, first of all, public opinion polling, you see a vast increase starting with the progressive era and a secular trend, maybe interrupted by a bubble in the last couple of years, of a growth toward the independent voter. If you look at Mike Schutzen's work about the notion of the citizen as the rational decider. These are not images of the partisan voter that you would have seen if you'd done the anthropological work of parties, say, in the 1870s. We have a different relationship to parties than we had more than a century ago in the late 19th century. We have an increase in nonpartisan independent voting. We have statistics which show us that partisan identity is much less strong. There's more liability to break with partisan rules, but it is the case that parties are strong signalers, that they do have a lot of influence on people's opinions. I don't want to disagree with any of that. What I want to say is that they're part of public opinion formation, but they by no means dominate it. So if I'm a member of the NRA, I want to influence public opinion. I don't think of that as a partisan identity. If I'm ACLU, the same. If I'm Sierra Club, the same, right? So if you look at campaign finance in Great Britain, what you'll discover is that there are very, very strong restrictions on independent expenditures in election districts for members of parliament, even though they elect, like we do, first past the post, and even so it's individual. And I think at one point it was as low as £5. You can only spend £5 in support. This gets taken to Strasbourg. Strasbourg says that's inconsistent with freedom of speech. The British House of Lords takes it up against it. They didn't really think about this very carefully. But if you think about why it is that they can do that in Great Britain, it's really that the party is governing the election. And that the idea of representation in Britain and of legitimation of self-government is through the party, through the parliament. And we just have a fundamentally different idea of what self-government is. It's not, we don't give our self-government over to a party. We don't give sovereignty over to the king and parliament. We say the people are sovereign, and the people are existing in this pluralist manner that we were talking about earlier with Noah, in which the party is one figure, but only one figure in this large melange in which public opinion is a crucible, in which public opinion is forming. So I don't want to disagree with what you're saying, but I don't want to overstate it either. And I would say the phenomenological experience of most Americans is when they go out and try to change public opinion in matters that they really care about, the party may or may not be relevant, and is as frequently not relevant as it is relevant.
Mike.
Mike Nadia from the Kennedy School. Robert, I had a question about your account of representation, the theory of representation. Listening to you, I saw an account of representation as the transmission of public opinion. I heard quite a lot about the connection between the citizenry and the represented. What I heard almost nothing about in your account is lawmaking. A representative is a lawmaker. And that's important for where you're going. It's real important because you might not be able to get an account of why you should restrict money in politics in relation to opinion formation, but you could pretty easily, in a hop, skip, and a jump, get an account of why you absolutely want to control money in the making of law. And the problem that the public has with corporate money and big money in politics is not that they make a big noise, but that they get the laws they want in a manner which seems deeply undemocratic. So you've got to get a stronger account of lawmaking and legislation in this account if you're going to get any account of a First Amendment jurisprudence that could protect the legislative function, not the opinion formation, but the legislative function of a representative in a democracy, because that seems to me what you'd have to change in the jurisprudence to get some story that says we got to get money under control, because what you want to control is the making of law, right? And that seemed to me missing, at least as I heard it, in your account of representation.
Well, I mean, the way I would formulate that question is you want government action to be responsive to public opinion, and action is often in the form of lawmaking. It can also be in the form of rulemaking and executive, but so let's take the paradigmatic case is I want the government to be responsive to public opinion. I want it to make laws which reflect or take account of public opinion. So that pulls us back now, of course, to public opinion formation and the relationship of money to public opinion formation. In the Canadian system, as you know well, in the Harper case, the court says there's a conflict between freedom of speech and the integrity of the electoral process, and the integrity of the electoral process in an election takes precedence precisely because we want equality in lawmaking. So the logic that you're putting on the table is one that the Canadian Supreme Court has adopted, and the question is how that would fit with our American First Amendment jurisprudence in terms of the relationship between money and opinion formation. That's where we have to, in the United States, that's where we're going to have to take that.
Excuse me, I'm Dick Fallon from the law school.
How are you?
Hi. So my question is why you gave us the fascinating lecture that you gave us today, which is essentially a lecture in American intellectual history. And so to situate that on two sides, on the one side, it could have been Yokai's question about why intellectual history instead of other forces that somebody might think drives history through all this period in US history. The other side is why didn't, in response to other questions, you're saying, well, you think Justice Kennedy cares about ideas and he cares about legitimacy and values. And so if that's what you really care about, why wouldn't you just have talked about values in their own terms rather than the history of the way that people thought about values? So I assume you're imagining that when the case comes before the Supreme Court or these issues are going to be resolved, there are going to be a lot of people who care in one way or another about the intellectual history that, excuse me, that you've recited to us. And then my question is, well, how and why? It's not part of the legal framework to try to interpret what Herbert Crowley was saying back in turn of the century America. So it's not internal to the law, and that's why now I'm just fumbling inarticulately with where I started. Why did you give us this fascinating story rather than talk to us about something else?
Well, I mean, many, many levels of answers to that question, but the first is because it was fascinating. The second is I'm looking at this opinion and I'm thinking, where do I go with this? How do I mediate this conflict? And I tend to find that when you have a conflict, it tends to have a backstory and a history. And when you see the history of the formation of the conflict, you learn a lot about it, and you learn a lot about its structural propensities such that you can begin to see solutions which weren't visible to you before. So history is a great flashlight to pose on abstract questions. And third, we're talking here about law, and in particular constitutional law, which has a function. Among the function is to create a we who give allegiance to this Constitution. Well, how do we create that sense of we and that sense of shared commitments to principles? One of the best ways to do it, one of the ways we always do it, is by a shared history. Memory memory gives the affective as well as the cognitive components to a lot of principles. And they create the staged pragmatic horizon in which we enact principles. And without those memories, if they were just skating on the surface of pure reason, I don't think they would mean much to most of us. So if I'm talking to Kennedy and I wanted to convince him, I would do it by invoking, I think that's true of any argument that's convincing, it's by appealing to things we have in common. We have in common this history. And if he wants to embrace this history, he's got to be committed to certain things that history teaches. Now, he could refuse that invitation by saying, that's not my history. In my history, we had First Amendment rights the day the First Amendment was enacted. He's got a little showing to do to make that history real. But if he wants to say that, then he can say that. But then we have a discussion. Is that really your history? And if it isn't, what consequence does that have for you as you talk to me about what the First Amendment means? So it's a way of initiating a conversation. It's a way of finding what a Constitution is supposed to be, which is common ground. And so I'm not making an originalist argument. I'm not saying because Herbert Crowley said it, we are compelled by it. I'm trying to illuminate the origins and the skeletal structure and the dynamics of a conflict that we ourselves have, and that tomorrow I hope to be able to use to good account in a more abstract legal way.
You made a very interesting point about the percentage of the electorate.
About what?
About the percentage of the electorate. 80% of the people were voting. And suddenly, towards the beginning of this of the 20th century, the percentage came down to about 50%. Yeah. Now, that could have two opinions. One is that what about the other 50%? How would they participate in democracy? Would it be through public opinion? That is one aspect. And the other is money power. Now, money power could be more easily used to influence the 50% who vote, and they don't have to bother with the remaining 30% who would have normally voted. So this is an interesting point. Perhaps you could develop on that in your lectures tomorrow, about the only 50%
yes.
of the voters vote in the electorate. The other 50% are not, they don't participate in democracy.
We have much less, yeah. I mean, if participation in democracy is measured by voting, it gets worse. The story gets worse as we go forward in time. And so that's an issue for us. That's an issue for us that we have to account for and that we have to talk to ourselves about. What these people do, I don't have the means to tell you. But that it is a problem that only X% vote, that I think you don't need to be the seventh son of a seventh son to see.
Robert Post, thank you very much. Nadia Urbinati, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.